I have judged the Northwood Regional Youth Piano Championship for 11 years, and in that time I have learned to recognize the shape of a familiar morning before the doors are even opened, the rustle of programs, the squeak of folding chairs being set in rows across the floor of Bracken Hollow Civic Hall, the smell of floor wax and cold coffee, the parents arranging themselves along the back wall like a second jury nobody asked for. The competition falls in late October every year, and by the time the cars start filling the gravel lot, the birches up behind the hall have already gone the color of old brass, so that everyone arrives a little chilled and a little distracted, thinking about coats more than counterpoint. I thought I knew every variation that morning could offer. I was wrong, and I am glad of it. The hall itself is not much to look at, a converted granary from the days when this part of the valley shipped wheat instead of music students, its rafters still visible, its acoustics decided more by accident than design. But the piano is a good one, a Steinway the town has kept tuned and oiled for 40 years on a budget that never quite makes sense on paper, and on competition mornings it sits alone on the low stage like something waiting to be asked a question. I was at the judges' table that year with 2 colleagues and our artistic director, Edgar Holt, a tidy, exacting man who ran the competition the way he had once run his own conservatory studio, with a clipboard, a stopwatch, and very little patience for anything he hadn't pre-approved. It was Edgar's habit to read the applications aloud before the first round began, partly for the audience's benefit and partly, I suspect, for his own. He liked the sound of credentials. Conservatory of this. Studied privately with that. It gave the morning a kind of order he found reassuring, and most years I found it reassuring too, a way of knowing, roughly, what we were in for before a single key was struck. He was halfway through the stack when he stopped. "Sorrel," he said, turning the page toward the light as if it might read differently in better illumination. Win Sorrel. Age 15. He scanned further down, and I watched his mouth tighten the way it did when a form failed to give him what he wanted. Instructor, none listed. Institution, none listed. He looked up, and though his voice stayed light, almost amused, it carried clean to the back row. Self-taught, it says here. No conservatory, no private study, not even a community program. He set the page down with a small, deliberate tap, the way he punctuated most things he considered already decided. Well. Let's not embarrass the girl. Have her go first, and perhaps keep it simple, nothing too ambitious. We'll let the real preparation speak for itself afterward. A ripple of laughter went through the front rows, the easy, unthinking kind people offer 'em and they assume must be right. The judge beside me, a cellist named Pruitt who taught at the community college, murmured something about hoping the poor child had at least picked something short. I confess I nodded along with all of it, or near enough. 11 years at that table teaches you to trust the paperwork. A self-taught 15-year-old walking onto that stage with no instructor of record was, by every measure I had ever used, a kindness wasted on the wrong morning. She came up from the 3rd row when her name was called. I noticed her before I noticed anything about her playing, the way you notice anyone who doesn't quite match the room. The other contestants that morning wore the soft, expensive blacks their teachers had recommended for stage presence, and carried their music in leather folios with their names embossed along the spine. Win Sorrel wore a denim jacket 2 sizes too large for her, sleeves rolled twice, with a faint pale stain along one cuff I would later learn was bar soap, scrubbed in and never quite out, and she carried her single sheet of program notes folded once in her back pocket rather than in any folder at all. Her hands, when she finally set the paper down on the piano's edge, were not a 15-year-old's hands. They were a woodsman's daughter's hands, broad-knuckled, a little chapped, with the kind of permanent quiet strength you only get from years of real work. A man near the back, her father as it turned out, sat very still with a canvas coat folded over his knee and a wool cap turning slowly in his hands, an expression I can only describe as a man holding his breath on purpose. She crossed to the piano, and before she sat, she did something I have never seen another contestant do in 11 years of mornings like that one. She ran her thumb once along the underside of the keyboard lid, slow and careful, the exact gesture I'd watched my own father make 1,000 times checking a fence rail for splinters before he leaned his weight on it. It took me a moment to place where I'd seen it. When I did, something in my certainty about the morning shifted, very slightly, the way a held door shifts before you notice the wind has changed. She sat. She did not look at Edgar. She did not look at the room. She set her hands in her lap for a breath longer than was comfortable to watch, long enough that I heard someone 2 rows back shift in their seat, and then she began. It was Liszt, un sospiro, a sigh, though I doubt she'd have used that word for it. The opening notes came so softly I saw two judges lean forward to be sure they were hearing anything at all, a single line, rising and falling, almost apologetic. I remember thinking, with the small relief of a man whose assumptions are about to be confirmed, that this was exactly the cautious, simple reading Edgar had all but ordered. I remember being wrong within 4 bars. The left hand widened first, the arpeggios opening out beneath the melody like something unfolding rather than being played, each note laid down with the patience I associate with people who have spent their whole lives waiting for things to grow. Then her right hand crossed over, and crossed again, in that long unbroken sweep the piece demands and rarely receives intact. The melody passed hand to hand so smoothly that for a moment I forgot to track which fingers were doing the work at all. The sound stopped being notes and started being weather, wind moving high up where you can't feel it on the ground, the kind that bends the tops of trees while the trunks stand perfectly still. It built once, eased back, and built again higher than before, each wave a little more sure of itself than the last, as though she were not so much performing the piece as remembering, in real time, that she was allowed to. I have heard that piece played by professionals in concert halls with twice the ceiling height and a third the heart. I had never heard it sound like something a person had built alone, board by board, with no one to tell her she was doing it wrong. The hall went quiet in the particular way I have only felt a handful of times at that table, not the polite quiet of an audience being patient, but the quiet of 200 people simultaneously forgetting they had somewhere else to be. I stopped writing on my score sheet. I am ashamed to say it took me that long to notice I had stopped. Edgar Holt had not moved. I was watching him as much as I was watching her by then, an old judge's habit of reading the room through its most stubborn member, and I watched the pen in his hand go still above a scorecard he had not marked. His mouth, which an hour before had shaped that careless little joke about embarrassment, hung very slightly open, and stayed that way through the long unbroken cascade in the second half, through the moment her hands crossed a final time and the melody climbed back up out of the storm she'd built beneath it, thinning, lifting, until it was almost the same single apologetic line it had begun as, except now we all knew exactly what it had cost to sound that simple. The last note did not so much end as get released. She lifted her hands the way you lift them off something you trust to keep its shape without you, and for a long moment nobody in that converted granary made a sound. I have judged competitions where the silence after a good performance is a kind of held breath waiting for permission. This was not that. This was a room that had simply forgotten, for 3 or 4 full seconds, how a hall is supposed to behave. Then it broke all at once, not the polite ripple of applause we give a competent piece, but something closer to a wave finding the shore it had been gathering toward the whole time. People were on their feet before I quite registered standing myself. I looked down at my own hands, applauding, and found I could not remember deciding to. Edgar Holt did not stand last out of anything so simple as politeness. He stood last because, for what I believe was the first time in the 11 years I had shared that table with him, he had nothing prepared to say. He set down his pen. He took off his glasses and pressed 2 fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose, the way a man does when he is recalculating something he had thought was already settled. When he finally rose, he did not look at the application in front of him, the one with his own neat handwriting still crossed through the empty instructor's line. He looked instead toward the back row, toward the men in the canvas coat, who had also risen, slowly, the way men do when they are not entirely sure their legs will hold the news. Edgar did not say a word to either of them. He simply stood there, applauding longer than anyone else at that table, until his own hands looked tired of it before he did. I will tell you what I felt, because it is the only part of that morning that was truly mine to keep. I had spent 40 years at pianos, as a student with promise nobody quite knew what to do with, as a performer in rooms a good deal grander than that granary for a decade or so before my nerves got the better of the work, and for the last 11 as a man with a clipboard who had quietly decided he already knew most of what a piano had left to teach him. I had told myself, for most of those 11 years, that this was simply what age does to a musician, that the wanting gets traded, sensibly, for the watching. Judging is a comfortable retirement from wanting things. I do not believe I had been moved, truly moved, by a performance in longer than I would like to admit, and I had stopped noticing the absence the way you stop noticing a clock has gone quiet in a room you no longer enter, until something walks back in and the silence it left behind suddenly has a shape. When Sorrel did not announce where she had learned to play. She did not need to. I found out later, in the unhurried way these things surface at competitions, from a parent who knew her family, who mentioned the mother who had died when one was 9, the upright piano left behind in a cabin at the edge of the tree line, and the stack of sheet music nobody else in that house had known what to do with. Nobody had taught her where to put her hands. She had simply sat with that music, alone, through winters when the roads up there go bad for weeks at a time, the way her father sat with a fence line until he understood exactly where it wanted to go, and built herself a teacher out of patience because there was no other kind available. She did not win every category that day. There were other fine players, other quieter mornings ahead for them too, and I will not pretend the rest of the competition mattered less for any of them. But I have judged a great many mornings since, and I have stopped reading applications the way Edgar once read them, as though a blank line under instructor tells a man everything he needs to know about what's coming. I watch hands instead, now. I watch the way a person tests a piano before they trust it with their weight. I think of her sometimes, walking back out across the gravel lot that evening with her father, the two of them small against the tree line as the light went down behind it, no trophy in her hands that I could see, nothing to show for the morning but the ordinary look of a girl heading home to chores that didn't care what she'd just done. I doubt she thought of it as a victory. I have come to think it was something steadier than that, the kind of thing a hall remembers long after it has forgotten who took first place, and a judge remembers longer still, on the mornings when the doors open and he thinks, just for a moment, that he already knows what's coming, the sound of a door he thought he'd closed for good, opening again, on its own, without asking his permission.